All right. So, hello everyone, and welcome to People for Cities. My name is Pritika Akhil Kumar, and I'm the host of today's session. I'm an architect and urbanist based in Chennai, and I'm also the founder of CoLab. So, CoLab is a design and research firm based in Chennai, and People for Cities is our initiative through which we hope to engage with wider sections of the general public on key issues that shape our city. So, in this period of lockdown, we have been hosting a few webinars. We've done two sessions of webinar one so far, and this is our second sort of offering. So today's session will look at how we as ordinary citizens and as designers and architects and planners can get involved in the issues that affect us and our cities, essentially. So to start with, we are going to have a quick sort of interactive session on defining the term citizen, what it means to be a citizen, and what are their roles and responsibilities. So to start with, I would request you all to actually head to this website, www.menti.com, and enter the code displayed on your screen. Yeah, so you should be shown a screen like this, and you can just enter the code here. In the meanwhile, so to start with, this is our first question for you today. What are some of the words you would use to describe a citizen? What does it mean to be a citizen? So if you start entering some words into the screen that is displayed, then those should start showing up in just a second. Yeah, so some words coming through now. Let's keep it going. We're going to have it on for a minute or so, and so that everyone can participate. Yeah, we'll keep it open for another 30 seconds. If all of you could just enter your chosen words, irrespective of whether or not they are on the screen already. All right, so we have a reasonable idea of what it means to be a citizen, whether it is in the Indian context or anywhere in the world, essentially. We see the citizen as someone who needs to be responsible in terms of maintaining a democracy, in terms of maintaining law and order, but also just as residents, as inhabitants of a certain place. And with that comes some rights and responsibilities. right? Yeah, so with that come some rights and responsibilities. So these are what we will be discussing in the next question. Uh, so now for my next question, which should come up on your screen right now. What are the responsibilities of a citizen? If you could just add in some. Yeah, so we have a few coming in now. If you can, for those who've just joined us, if you can just head to www.menti.com and use the code displayed on your screen, you will be able to respond to this question. We're just discussing what the roles and responsibilities of a citizen should be, and I thought what better way uh, than to ask fellow citizens themselves to kind of define what their role is and what their responsibilities are. So if you can just keep adding to this. We'll give it a minute so that everyone can have their say, and then we will get back to the presentation soon. Apologies, I'm coughing a little bit. I'm a little under the weather, but hopefully this shouldn't interfere too much with the presentation. Them coming. About 30 seconds. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up now. So what's interesting here is that many people seem to have indicated that voting is a primary responsibility, but apart from that, many people have also indicated that participating in a city or in civic activities, community participation, these are some of the buzzwords I find here. Political awareness is great as well, but in practice, it's important to also see how much of this is the case. Obeying law and order, that is another one. Advocacy, helping out each other, but unfortunately, well, rather unfortunately, I would say that in today's cities, we find quite a bit of disconnect from each other, and the sense of community is quite eroded. So that being said, we're going to quickly head back to our presentation. Yeah, so I would request all of you to stop, to not, exit the meeting and keep coming back, because it is a little problematic to handle everything as we're doing the presentation. It's a little disruptive, but coming back to this, how do you get involved? So in terms of our understanding of of being a citizen, it seems quite strong. But in terms of actual spatial practice, how do we approach urban issues? There are two main approaches that can be observed. Uh, so the first is, yeah, my apologies. There seems to have been some issue when I was locked out, but I'm back now. So let's resume. So, with any sort of civic process, but mainly spatial practice, there are two main ways of approaching any issue. The one on your left that you see is a top-down process, and the one on your right that you see is a bottom-up process. So, in a typical top-down process, you will find that decisions are generally made by government agencies. Apologies again. I don't know why this is happening, but let's resume. So as I was saying, in any top-down process, decisions regarding any issue are made at the top by government agencies, politicians, and other people in power, like say funding agencies. So these decisions are made at the top, and they're not generally made in consultation with with everyday citizens, and who eventually have to inhabit and use these amenities, civic amenities, especially in terms of infrastructure projects, in terms of city planning. But unfortunately, all the decisions are made at the top and kind of imposed on citizens. Of course, there are levels to this kind of process where the amount of say you have in that process kind of decreases as you go down the levels. At the same time, on the other hand, we have the bottom-up process which originates from citizens, activists, community organizations, neighborhood groups who kind of initiate a process of um, changing their urban environments, and that is generally done in cooperation with advocacy groups, nonprofit groups, artists, planners, designers. So in that section, we see the kind of people who enable that process with the assistance of the citizens. And then it goes up to, say, private funders, corporate agencies who might want to fulfill their corporate social responsibility, for example, and then it is taken to the level of the government for maybe final approval, things like that. So in this kind of environment, I remember from my last webinar that there was a question, how do we as citizens, as frustrating as it is, get involved in the city? How can we affect any change? What are the methods that we could employ? So as you can see on your screen, there are several methods that we could employ. Um, these could be, as simple as having a questionnaire and going around conducting interviews, or it could be as interesting as playing a board game, as you can see on the left of your screen, which is actually a process that happened in Bangalore, where where a design group kind of created a board game to deal with the solid waste management problem in Bangalore, to get citizen input in how you would deal with that scenario. Or you could have some kind of pop-up appropriation of space. So generally what we see is streets are largely taken over by automobiles, and you don't really see it as a public space or a civic space of any sort. So this is the second image that you see is an interesting take um, on how the street could be used through the appropriation of the street for a pop-up dinner for a large number of people. Then we do have our protests, which take place in large numbers whether it's the Occupy movement or the women's march that you've seen around the world, Black Lives Matter in India, whether it was the CAA protests. All these are ways of getting involved in the decisions that matter to us and kind of shape our urban lives. So what I'm going to do next is to discuss a few case studies. Of these, one is a study that I was involved in, and the other are observations of projects that have taken place all around the world. So generally what happens when we kind of look at, community participation or citizen involvement, we tend to find a lot more examples from the West, simply because the kind of democracy is a little different, but the kind of participation that is possible in the global South due to various conditions is quite different from the North. So we are going to be looking at two case studies from India, which kind of are examples of what happens in the global South. But at the same time, we have two examples from Paris and New York, and we'll be discussing those as well. So this is a project called ECObox. It is situated in Paris. This basically looks at the reappropriation of space, where a group of architects and designers kind of enabled a community occupation of underused public spaces in the La Chapelle area of Paris, and kind of converted that space into a community garden, which becomes a space where people can interact with each other, engage with each other, and also grow sort of plants for the community. Few cooking stations set up where you can have small scale events. So this was something done by the design team called Atelier Architecture Autogéré, or AAA, which is based in Paris, as I said. So what they've done basically is very, very simple, quick, cost-effective here, where they've just used some wooden pallets to kind of define areas for walking and for planting, and created a neighborhood garden, essentially. So these are some of the stakeholders that they've mapped who are involved, including universities, students, local researchers, designers, artists. So it's a whole ecosystem of people who are involved in transforming the space. But the fact that so many of the residents are also involved means that you have a huge mobilization of people who want this to happen. And in the bargain, when you create such a space, there is also quite a strong sense of ownership, which means that such a space is well managed and taken care of by the community, and also enjoyed by all members of the community. So this is not a permanent space, since sometimes what happens is when these sites are activated, the government or some kind of local players might come in and say that the people who own the site might want to use it again, since there's so much activity around it. So in that case, such a temporary garden is simply moved to another site which is empty. And so there's that endless cycle of activation that happens. And at the same time, you have a community space that is for everyone. So these are some of the modules they created for the, like some of the temporary, not temporary, but like low-cost materials that they've used to create furniture or, installations on site, which can be used to facilitate their activities. So the second is a project called Urban Spaces of Reuse. This was a project which I carried out in Chennai in 2017. It was an academic research project, but the basic idea was to go into this historical neighborhood, which is Paris in Chennai, and kind of see how their historical buildings, which have been abandoned, to evaluate what value those buildings had to people. Now, these are not like big important buildings like say the High Court building or the State Bank building. These are not important sites like this. These were Victorian warehouses, mills, small Armenian church was one of the buildings as well. And these are all buildings in serious states of decay. So the idea was to kind of evaluate the importance of these spaces to the local community, and also to see whether these spaces could be appropriated, again, temporarily, um, to create public spaces for people in Chennai, because something that is true of many Indian cities is that we have public spaces are a dying breed in India, actually, because inevitably public spaces are taken over by corporate organizations or by government agencies. So there is not like a true sense of freedom in these spaces. And I will come back to that when we discuss Shaheen Bagh. But so that was the idea behind this research project. And as you can see here on your screens to the right, I've mapped out sort of what organizations are involved in each phase. What are the activities that need to happen? Why is it necessary? And so on. So this was meant to be a phased project, which would require action over a period of 20 years, starting from the immediate future. So in phase one, I sort of looked at how research could be conducted in a sort of participatory manner, because again, it's important to not just have one method of participation and like a multiplicity of methods make sure that you get that much more rich data. So the research here was conducted through an online questionnaire to understand the general mood of the of Chennai's residents about the city, about the historic character of this neighborhood, about what they perceive as public spaces, and so on. So that was one of the methods of survey. The second method of survey was a walk that was organized through this neighborhood. But there was a simple catch that this heritage walk, which is all the rage now in India, actually, this heritage walk wouldn't kind of present a factual history of this area. The idea was that I presented a constructed history of the area, where it would be imagined as a settlement, as an independent settlement of its own, self-sufficient settlement of its own. So in that sense, if you had to walk through this neighborhood, what would be the uses put to these individual buildings that were being studied? So this kind of gave me excellent cues as to what uses could be put to these buildings. And then finally, I also did a lot of informal street interviews where I spoke to people who worked there, who lived on the streets, children, adults, the whole spectrum, to understand what it feels like to live and work in such a space. Because often what happens in such projects is that we as designers go and impose our views on them, which doesn't really work on site very well. So phase two, so this was phase one, and that was actually conducted on site. Phase 2, 3, and 4 were proposed. So phase 2 would have looked at appropriating these chosen buildings. There were 7 in all. So we'd look at appropriating these buildings using some temporary devices like scaffolding, or the community garden space using pallets, like a play area, performance spaces, so on and so forth. So the idea was to conduct a a week-long Madras Week festival, which actually happens every year, but to host it in this neighborhood through these individual buildings, so that there is an activation of interest in the area, and then leveraging this interest, there could be public spaces that are more permanently established in these buildings. So when I say permanently established, I use that term permanent quite loosely, because these again are going to be temporary urban spaces that are established using these devices, but for more prolonged periods of time. So essentially, again, like the ECObox project, you could you're not actually touching the structure of the building. You're not modifying anything with the building. You're simply co-opting the building for people from the neighborhood, and who will also maintain it till they are using the space. And if tomorrow, say, a government agency wants to come back and use the space again, then you can just shift out of that space and reappropriate another building which is not being used. So based on this, the idea was that we would create sites where such activation would take place over a longer period of time, and that in turn would trigger a more general urban renewal of the area, so that this area, which is very congested in terms of traffic, there are very narrow streets, it's crowded. So this kind of interest in the area, like genuine citizen interest in the area, would kind of hopefully trigger an urban renewal where things like pedestrianization and kind of the repair of these buildings, or preservation of the architectural character of this area, all those things could be looked at more comprehensively. So this is the temporary space that I was talking, temporary public space that I was talking about in phase 3. As you can see, there's nothing that is done to the actual structure of the building. It's just scaffolding used to create this kind of space for public interaction using different devices, whether it's a vegetable cart, whether it's little pots and plants, whether it's floor painted games, artwork, so on and so forth. So, so the first two that we saw were essentially initiated by the intermediaries. By intermediaries, I mean the designers involved. They didn't really come from the neighborhood groups as such, or the individual citizens as such. So in the next two examples, we will be looking at something that was, we will be looking at examples that were born out of citizen interest. So this is Highline in New York. Highline was a part of the New York Central Railway, if I'm not wrong. And it was abandoned. This section was abandoned in 1980. So following this, there were a lot of calls for demolition of this elevated railway line. What happened with this structure was that over a period of time, a lot of wild plants grew on this structure, which inspired a few citizens and neighborhood groups to kind of come around and say that this could probably be something for the community here. So to that end, an organization, a non-profit organization called Friends of the Highline was founded by Joshua David and Robert Hammond, who were residents of this area. So following the creation of this organization and kind of interest from private funding agencies, ideas competitions were launched, and then based on those competitions, more and more funding was acquired, and construction of this park, essentially a public park, started in 2006. Eventually, the people who owned this railway line also donated this stretch of the railway line to New York City's Department of Parks and Recreation. So this was done in 2009, and slowly the construction has been going on. It still is going on, and sections of this renewed sort of public park have been opened between 2012 and 2014. But like I said, further sections are still under development. Now, in keeping with the way in which the wild plants kind of grew on their own in this stretch, the Greenway is still home to 500 different species of plants and trees. So there is a certain ecological importance also attached to it. And it's maintained currently by Friends of the High Line and NYC Parks. Now, again, with this kind of project, there is an issue that happens, which is that such an attractive kind of development invites a lot of interest in the area, invites a lot of corporate interest in the area. And slowly this area is going through a process of gentrification, which means that the residents who lived here originally when this, sort of project was initiated, those people are being pushed out due to extremely high rents and other issues that kind of arise out of that situation. So there is a struggle, and there is again a neighborhood-led effort to kind of stop this gentrification and kind of still make this area usable and for the enjoyment of its original residents who are currently being pushed out, as I said. Now, the last example that we're going to be looking at is Shaheen Bagh in Delhi. So I'm sure most of you are aware of this. We're not really looking at the political angle of this, but the fact that a protest kind of created a settlement of its own in what is essentially a public street. That's the angle we're going to be looking at this from. So Shaheen Bagh, if anyone is not aware, the protest took place against the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act, which was introduced in 2019, and 2019, yeah. And as a result of that kind of law, there was a general protest that broke out all over the country, but especially in Shaheen Bagh, which was occupied for a period of 101 days until the coronavirus outbreak and the consequent lockdown had to kind of mean that these people had to leave the area. So if you notice, this movement was generally led by Muslim women, but mainly Muslim women. There were a lot of artists, students involved from surrounding universities. If you see, there is a strong kind of urban character to this protest, in that there was tents set up, there were areas set up for, a library, a meal service where people were cooking and serving food to the protesters. There was a lot of public art in this space where footbridges were taken over, and kind of you saw all these wall murals coming up, and there was a constant sort of cycle of new art coming up every other day. There was this footbridge that was taken over by art. You saw local children coming in and even getting involved. So if you look at it simply as a protest and as a form of participating in your city, it's quite an interesting example, because not only do all the people who are interested in this cause get involved significantly, but it also kind of creates a public space in an area which was a simple street used for infrastructure. Now, when I said that there was a serious lack of public space in India, what I meant is that even in the case of Shaheen Bagh, the Supreme Court kind of said that you need to be protesting in areas that are allocated for protests. Unfortunately, there is no such thing. We do not really have squares or sort of European public spaces here where people kind of sit, enjoy evenings, or kind of interact with each other. So, this appropriation of this space is kind of a last ditch effort because you do not have other spaces to do this in. So, it's quite interesting how citizens essentially created their own public space. So, with these case studies in mind, we're just going to have a quick activity session. If each of you could think of one urban issue that you're passionate about, whether it's the fact that there are not enough public spaces in the city, like I am, or whether it's about, you know, opposition to certain laws, or whether it's about the climate strikes, or so on and so forth. So you can kind of choose what issue you are passionate about. And then I will be sending you all into breakout rooms of 3 or 4 people each. So you can kind of discuss what your chosen topic is and how you would get involved in it. So this could be as simple as sending a postcard to your local government authorities. It could be as radical as sitting down in a protest. It could be as simple as taking a sofa, setting it in the middle of the road, claiming it to be, public space, and sitting down there. Um, there are different ways of kind of creating awareness and getting involved in these issues. And the more creative, the more effective you might be. So, two questions I'd like you to think about: how would you participate in this kind of issue of your choice? And who are your allies or your associated stakeholders that you can also get involved and receive support from? Yeah, so I'm going to, yeah, so I'm going to wait for everyone to come back in. I think we're all back in actually. So you guys can feel free to kind of take yourselves off of mute and continue with this conversation because Purvi, I think, was talking about participation in sort of urban issues. So if you guys want to continue, or you want to discuss what you've kind of discussed in your individual groups, that would be great.
Yeah, I think that yeah, this was just first thought as I started being participant of your this presentation.
Right.
Okay, yeah, but there is one thing which hits me a lot is whenever we are looking at top down approach or bottom up approach, initially we are only talking about some action groups, okay, not
Yeah.
citizen as an individual. We are still lacking somewhere in this in our democracy. And there are many there are like really very less examples where we can actually say that people came up and voiced for themselves.
Absolutely. So there are certain complexities that come with uh, being a democracy in a developing country, which does not always enable the amplification of voices from every strata of society. So that is probably why you see a lot more engagement from action groups, which kind of catalyze local communities to get involved, and you know that being more of a
Yeah,
general
it's
practice.
more like, yeah, it's more like igniting people and instigating certain thought process in them rather than it should be voiced out from people's side.
Right.
Maybe something like what this in this Bohra community in Mumbai, they had pulled down their entire apartment, and they had like refurbished the entire zone. It's I think in 2008 or 9 somewhere. That is something like, but these kind of examples are very rare in India.
Right. Like I
And
said,
I
there
see,
is
yeah,
a bit of, there is some way to go towards,
yeah, maybe
getting to
because
that
we have a
point.
lot of, yes, maybe because we have a lot of barriers like caste, economy,
Yeah, it's a very
educated,
strongly,
non-educated.
yeah, very
Yeah,
strongly hierarchical sort of
yeah, and
democracy
we
that
are
we
not,
live in.
though we are urbanized, we are not able to come out of those barriers and become a single, a unified strata of community
Right,
like other countries. Yeah.
right. Anybody else from breakout room one? If you could kind of give us a brief of your discussions. Breakout room one was,
Hi.
I think,
Yeah.
Neeti uh, Abdirami, I think.
Yeah. Hi, this is
Yeah,
Abhirami.
yeah, hi.
So
So,
mostly we were discussing about how we view spaces in the places we live in,
mhm,
and the kind of connections that we can make between people, and just how we behave in different spaces.
right,
Because it, we can always construct spaces, but if there's no engagement in it, or if people don't feel strongly for it, then it doesn't really do anything. That was kind of the discussion and the back and forth that we had from our own sides. That's what we had. You're on mute, please.
right. But did you kind of have any discussions about any issues that you were kind of passionate about and how you could probably bring some awareness to it or effect some kind of change based on that?
We didn't necessarily discuss affecting change as such, but we kind of just looked at the places we lived in, where we live in, with the
Right,
professions that we have. For
right.
example, Neeti is a designer and I'm a journalist. So how
Yeah,
do we contribute to these spaces, and how does our job sort of take a look at these spaces around us?
right.
Was the discussion we were having.
Right. So you're kind of situating yourselves in the narrative and the work that you do as enabling certain kind of engagement with your surroundings, right?
Yeah, sort of using our profession as the pathway to enact that change.
Okay, great. Breakout room two. Oh, sorry, I think breakout room three, if I'm not wrong, since we had Purvi from breakout room two already.
Right.
Unless anyone else from that group wants to say anything. Echo, Salome, Jimish. All right, so we'll move on to breakout room three and then come back if anyone has any opinions they'd like to put forth. Tasneem?
So, some of the discussions we were having, like the causes that we were passionate about,
Mhm.
one was trying to maintain an ecological balance in our environment in the cities. That is something that Rohit said he was very passionate about. Uh, Another discussion that we had was how do we, like the same, what you were talking about, your study, right? Like how we take up the colonial spaces, like the built colonial structures, and how do we reuse that, like, and make it and sort of involve it in becoming the hub of the city activity, like how it's done in Mumbai, Kolaba region and all that. How
Okay.
these, like say Chennai, for instance. And so yeah, and we were discussing how these are the passions that we have, but then how do we address it? We did, all three of us strongly felt that it should come from the people, from the community, and not from any organization, because it's very difficult for an organization, like you said, because of the state of society that we live in, and we have such, like, the government is pretty much hope to expect anything from the government. And even most of the government, like corporates, we're talking about how maybe people can gather and you can have a community sort of bringing up these issues, addressing them, and maybe involving a corporate and their social, how they have their social sector clause, right, where they have a certain amount of money that they have to put in for this.
Yeah.
Maybe get them involved and have them to fund whatever, like a project. And like Deep was also saying how she feels that most of these corporate sectors, when they work on such projects, like how their focus is more on the infrastructure and the functionality of the space than the aesthetic of the space. And
Right.
how being involved as people and as the community, we can then address the aesthetic, the like how to make the space feel better, not just the use, like not just the functionality of it.
Yeah, but in many cases, there are also sort of community groups which might want change, but they're not really, they don't have access to kind of advocacy groups or design collaboratives or anything of the sort who might enable them to effect that change. So I think there is also a certain responsibility as research and design organizations to kind of be aware of what issues kind of affect our cities, and like if we could conduct not only awareness sort of sessions for raising awareness, but also to understand, to be in touch with local communities, to understand what issues come from them. So I feel like there still needs to be sort of this two-way conversation that needs to happen between the design community and the design advocacy artist communities with local communities, especially in the case of marginalized groups.
Definitely. So we were also thinking of what could be the first step in such a situation. Like if you're really looking to bring about change, like even say if you're looking to bring about change and say you live in a particular street, and if it's you're one person who has this idea, how do you gather similar minded people? How do you start off with? What could be the first step?
Absolutely. It could be as simple as, living in an apartment block and trying to get some kind of waste management practice in place, or getting solar panels added in. I know I'm still struggling with that in my building, but, so these are things you can probably say, I could probably, not pick up trash for 10 days, and maybe then someone might, notice that there is an issue, and then like they might come to question me, and then that is a way of engaging, like initiating a conversation on the topic.
Yeah, but how do you sensitize people also, because sometimes I feel like, maybe say for an instance, something that I've been thinking along the lines of, if just my street where I live in could manage waste well, if we could we could dig up one compost pit and use the compost pit for all our organic waste. But how do you explain to so many people who are not sensitized about how waste management should be done properly, how plastic should not be mixed, what if these compost pits start getting contaminated with plastic? Like who will then be in charge? Like what if it's a responsibility. Even on this scale, it becomes very difficult to handle.
Right. I think the main issue that most of us face in this kind of sector is mobilizing people to kind of get involved, right? So once you mobilize people, then you can engage with them and kind of raise awareness levels or sensitize people on these topics. But yeah, grabbing those eyeballs are not necessarily easy all times. But yeah, say for example, with your street, if you were to put up a tent and sit there, I mean, I'm sure at least 4 people come and ask you what you're doing,
right,
why you're doing it. And that starts a conversation. So, simple things that can be done to initiate that initial dialogue, which in most cases is the major roadblock, I feel.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I think so. Adding to what was being said right now, I also feel like there is another layer to civic participation and get sensitizing people, which is like interestingly enough, a lot of research shows that cities are very transient spaces.
So you don't really, or in your own lifetime, you might, especially our generation and like our future generations, we'll be moving a lot. So when
Right.
you move a lot, how much do you want to care about the space that you are in, is a major question that comes up then. If you really want to, ensure that people are participating in the sense that, they're actively joining meetings or taking community action or in taking initiative basically. So it also, I think, like in terms of thinking about the future of cities
Mhm.
by design, one also has to see what it means to be a part of a city.
De-
And that
Definitely.
question that you asked, right, that who is a citizen, I think that word itself has to evolve, especially in light of archaic laws like CA. We need to really examine what does it mean to be a citizen and what kind of rights are attached to it, because somehow the conversation then becomes, what do you get out of living in a city, in order for making people to be more sensitive to the surroundings.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought this up because, this spatial construct of a city itself is kind of questionable. Like, what is a city? Who really inhabits it? All of us live in these small circles. We live our entire lives in these small areas where I'm in Chennai, I'm in a particular neighborhood, but that doesn't mean I know all of my city. And if I don't know all of my city, why must I engage with it? So I think a city is quite, it needs to be questioned as a spatial construct. And also, I think that the neighborhood scale is a much more effective scale of planning, decision making, implementing sort of improvements in the local areas. I think it's a much more effective scale simply because the rates of interaction can be much higher. But then again, in the current scenario where we all live in like high-rise buildings where we don't know our neighbors even, it's a challenge. So these are conversations that need to be had, and I'm very grateful that you brought that up. Does anyone else want to say anything?
I think this, what Salome was talking about, when how you feel to feel connected to a city. I feel it's an internal process, right? Like it sort of comes from your sense of ownership. Where
I feel that it's a two-way process, essentially. How much ownership does your city afford you, and how much ownership do you claim over the city? So that's the kind of issue that we have in our local politics, is that there is a lack of engagement at both ends of the spectrum.
right. But I feel
I feel
Sorry.
Also like for example, it's like how you participate in the city, like Kritika rightly said, it's not necessarily limited to how you personally choose to engage. Sometimes your choice of engagement becomes quote unquote illegal. So when you sit in protest, you become the terrorist.
Exactly.
So it definitely is a multiple sort of ends you have to connect in looking at what civic participation really means, because sometimes uh, city governments and municipalities don't want people to be involved. They make sure that people don't get involved in decision making,
Uh,
so
I,
that there
I mean, what tends to happen mostly is that we tend to look at civic participation from a very Western point of view. Like if you were doing this somewhere in Germany or in the UK, you cannot be penalized for your actions so easily. So it's very important to kind of consider the local context and structure our dialogues accordingly, which unfortunately not a lot of conversation on that is happening. But we need to develop essentially Indian tactics of civic participation.
right.
Yeah. I think Rohit had something to say in between. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going back to your point about tackling the neighborhood as a whole, as a form of crowdsourced secondary governance, and taking ideas into control, and for sort of also taking after Purvi's comments from the beginning, where because of the society we live in, how would we sort of spearhead such a movement and enable such change at a neighborhood level? It's nice to think of it from an architectural standpoint or an urban standpoint on what a community would need in terms of spatial planning.
Right.
But then I feel also what Abhirami said about having, as a journalist, coming from her point of view, and then having that sort of diverse group that takes charge of a neighborhood and sort of speaks for that space is sort of like a more balanced way of approaching this sort of participation.
Absolutely, no disagreement there whatsoever. Unfortunately, though, in the current scenario, that is more of an ideal that we aspire to, and we need to work to get there. And that's why I think architects as facilitators have a responsibility to local communities rather than just producing glossy images of high-rise buildings. There is much more that we could be as a group, whether it's designers, architects, artists, journalists, for sure. Right. We have a sort of social responsibility there, which unfortunately is ignored in favor of monetary gain or other material benefits that you may get out of it. So it's been great to have this conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed today's dialogue, and I'm very grateful to all of you for participating so proactively.
So I feel can we maybe, like, as a group, is seeing like a bunch of people come together who are seemingly passionate about this cause, some maybe activity on a like, say, ground level, could help proliferate one of these, like one thing that we're thinking of, like it can
absolutely. So that is the reason why we've also created a Facebook group. So at this moment of lockdown and pandemics, it might not be that easy to engage physically, but the hope is that as more and more of you join this group, we can have more of a lively discussion and come up with solutions not from an authority point of view where a particular designer or one particular person makes the decisions. The idea is to have that sort of collaborative environment where everyone can kind of come out with their ideas, and we can sort of help each other out to make better cities for ourselves and for the people around us. So I will definitely be sharing that Facebook group with all of you, and also some general information that I'd like to put out. This webinar is going to be a monthly affair. So every Saturday, the Saturday of every last Saturday of every month will be when we have this webinar. I believe the next topic is going to be public space. Again, even the topics we discuss are something that we kind of vote on and decide. So the idea is to have a much more lively exchange. So I would highly recommend that you get involved. I will share all the relevant details with you all. So I think we're really over time right now. So I think it might be a good time to close this session here. But please do continue to stay involved and keep the conversation going.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.